Welcome, everyone. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And Josh Brister and I, he's my co-moderator, today are going to be interviewing Dr. Fuz Rana, and I'm very excited about that. He has a PhD from Ohio University in chemistry with a specialization in biochemistry. He graduated from another university prior to that with high honors. So he comes to us very well educated, and today we're going to talk about Christianity and science and whether the two are at odds, because there are a lot of people out there, a lot of skeptics who are trying to make the argument that the two are at odds. And so we found the perfect person to ask about this kind of stuff. And another very interesting thing about Dr. Rana is he is a former Muslim. So if anyone's Muslim in the audience, you'll be interested to hear how he determined that Christianity was the way, the truth, and the life, and he left the Muslim faith. That's not always easy to do. So making a big change like that. So we'll be hearing some pretty important, pretty exciting stuff today. And so without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Rana. If he'd share a little information about himself, and that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, currently I work at a ministry called Reasons to Believe. This ministry's been around well over 30 years. It was founded by astronomer Hugh Ross. And the goal of our organization is to show people how the latest discoveries in science provide evidence for God's existence and the reliability of the Old and New Testaments. And so our ultimate goal is to try to, again, show people that science, instead of being a threat or a challenge to the Christian faith, actually provides some of the greatest evidence for Christianity, with the hope that this will help build a bridge to the gospel. And we think our ministry is strategic in this day and age, just simply because we live in a world that's so strongly influenced by science and technology, and so often people equate science with the truth. And if people then hear scientists claiming that science invalidates the Christian faith, then they think that must be true, and it creates this widespread perception, as you're pointing out, that conflict exists. But in fact, that's not the case whatsoever.
Yeah, and I'm pretty familiar with Reasons to Believe too. We've interviewed Ken Samples and Hugh Ross from there on this channel, and so I'm really excited that we have a third person from Reasons to Believe. I think you guys in your ministry are doing a fantastic job, just a really amazing job sharing the good news, and you've been doing it for a while, right?
Yeah. I've been with Reasons to Believe 20 years now. So, and then prior to that, worked with them in a volunteer capacity for a few years. So I have a long association with Hugh Ross and with the RTB team.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So how did you come to Christianity? Maybe we should talk about that right now, because I do find it fascinating that you were a former Muslim, and you're the first Muslim, I think, on my channel. So I'm pretty excited. Former Muslim, I should say, on my channel.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a rather unusual home. My father was a devout Muslim. He was born in India, came to the United States in the 1950s with a freshly minted PhD in nuclear physics. And he met and married my mom, who came from a Catholic background, and she was non-practicing at that time. And so my father was extremely devout, but also rather progressive in his perspective. And I think many times as Christians, we neglect to realize that there's actually a very large segment of the Islamic world that are modern, that are progressive in their views, though yet at the same time extremely devout. Unfortunately, I think our perspective of Islam is tragically shaped by Islamic fundamentalism and what we see expressed in the Middle East. But in fact, there's a lot of Muslims around the world that are really very modern, very progressive, and that would classify my father. So he didn't expect my mom or ask my mom to convert to Islam. And so my mom, again, didn't practice Catholicism whatsoever. But my father, I remember getting up every morning, laying out a prayer carpet after going through a ritual cleansing, facing the east and praying. He carried a prayer booklet in his breast pocket everywhere that he went. Yet being somewhat progressive, my father didn't really expect my brother and I necessarily to embrace Islam. He basically said, it's up to you really to decide what you're going to do. When I was about 16 years old, I became really interested and curious about Islam. And part of it was my interest in connecting with my father, understanding my heritage. But I recited the Shahada. I began to pray. My father taught me how to pray, and I would pray every day, and I began to read from the Quran. And this went on for about a year or a year and a half. And I guess as a young man who's 17 years old, there were other things that began to tug and to pull on me, things like sports and rock music and girls. And so I kind of more abandoned Islam more so than rejected it, because I didn't feel like it was correct. But there was something, in retrospect, looking back on it, to me, Islam is very different than Christianity. For example, prayer is an obligation. It's not a time where we're as Christians, we pray and we're spending time really in God's presence, genuinely communicating with the transcendent creator that brought everything into existence. Of course, and our communication is mediated because of the blood of Christ. But as a Muslim, you're praying out of obligation. And as a young man, the fact that Islam was so demanding and so much, everything that I did was an obligation, it just felt to me burdensome. And so I basically gave up on it. And by the time I went to college, I would have said that I was an agnostic. I don't know that I would have denied God's existence outright, but the question of God just no longer became important to me. And I really immersed myself in the study of science and embraced an evolutionary framework. And it was largely because this was what, my college professors told me was the credible view of origins if you were in the sciences. And so I embraced that perspective. And it was studying biochemistry in graduate school, long story short, that convinced me that there had to be a mind behind everything, just because of the elegance and the sophistication and the ingenuity of biochemical systems. To me, that required a mind. And then I began to ask the question, okay, who is this creator? How do I relate to that creator? And long story short, I was challenged by a pastor who ultimately married my wife and I to read the Bible. He appealed to my pride as a scientist, basically saying, look, if you are a scientist, you should be open to evaluating truth claims, no matter where they come from. And how do you know that the Bible isn't true if you've never read it? And I thought, well, this is a valid point. And so I picked up the Gospel of Matthew and began to read. And it was really the Sermon on the Mount where I would say I encountered the person of Christ. And through that interaction with Christ, through Christ being revealed as a scripture, I became convinced that Christianity was true and converted to Christianity. So to me, it was really seeing very clear evidence that there had to be a creator from the record of nature, and then just immersing myself with an open mind and an open heart in scripture. And I would say having a supernatural experience where I encountered Christ, through that process. So to me, I guess I would say that I've been asked this question a lot. Why am I a Christian and not a Muslim? And I'm a Christian, not a Muslim, because I think Christianity is true. And I think what Scripture reveals to us about the nature of God and the nature of Christ, to me, is a coherent picture of God that explains quite a bit. And I just see powerful evidence historically for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ and the reliability of the Scriptures. So to me, I guess I would say I'm a Christian and not a Muslim, because I think Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then by default, Islam cannot be true.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you went to the book of Matthew, because that happens to be my favorite book. And someone just sent a tweet out not too long ago that said, if you could only pick one book in the entire Bible, which would it be? And for me, it'd be the book of Matthew. So
interesting, yeah.
It's kind of funny that that's the one you pick. I like it because it links up to the Old Testament so much. Mm-hmm. That's what I really like about it. There's a question in the audience. A couple of questions are coming in now, but one of them is, how did you meet that pastor that led you to read the Bible?
Well, I was engaged to be married, and my wife, who grew up in a Christian home and then who drifted away, rededicated her life to Christ, and she began attending this really small Pentecostal church in downtown Charleston, West Virginia, and Johnny Withrow was her pastor, and so she introduced me to Johnny, and that's how we ended up having that fateful conversation.
Wow, I like that. That's pretty neat. Another question that is being asked is basically about evolution. What's your position on evolution? And I know I mentioned to you before I was going to ask you a little bit about what you heard or what has been going around since the Royal Society, where scientists met and discussed some of the challenges with evolution.
Yeah. Well, to me, I would say that I don't necessarily reject the evolutionary paradigm outright, but rather there's aspects of the paradigm that I think are extremely are valid and extremely useful. So I have no issue with microevolution or even the idea of speciation or even evolutionary mechanisms generating the formation of different genera, or even working at a family level. But I question, and I have no problem with microorganisms evolving. But to me, what I question is this idea that evolution has genuine innovative potential. And I don't see how evolutionary mechanisms could generate the very first cells. To me, I think the origin of life question is a question where there's no explanation whatsoever. I also question if the mechanisms that can explain microevolution and speciation could be extrapolated to explain, again, biological innovation. And I don't think when it comes to the key transitions in life, like the origin of life, but even the origin of things that like eukaryotic cells or the origin of body plans, that evolutionary mechanisms can, as current, or at least the evolutionary paradigm is currently conceived, can account for those key transitions. And this also would include the origin of things like consciousness, or what I would call human exceptionalism. These are just places where the evolutionary paradigm falls short, and so I'm skeptical about that aspect of the evolutionary framework. But I also would embrace large amounts of paleontology, where I would say clearly there's a history to life on Earth, and that there are different organisms at different times in Earth's history. I don't dispute that, but I would interpret the history of life from the fossil record from a creation model vantage point, not an evolutionary vantage point.
Yeah, that's great. So, and I wanted to see, Josh, did you want to ask a question?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you so much for being here, Dr. Rana. In some of our discussions, when I have with atheists or so forth, I often bring up evolution as a very powerful argument for the existence of God, or for an advanced teleological argument. How would you craft?
Is Josh asking a question? Because I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't?
No, I can't hear Josh at all.
I can hear him. I wonder, Josh, is there a way to? Yeah. Well, but maybe I'll listen to his question and then I'll repeat it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, is there a way to use the evolution in an advanced teleological argument for the existence of God?
Okay, so Josh wants to know if there's a way that you can use a teleological argument as an advanced evolutionary argument for the existence of God.
Is there a way to use the teleological argument again? Okay, repeat that question.
An argument from design, essentially. Do you think that evolution, if you look at our design, would you say that you could make a pretty good case for?
Yeah. Well, if I understand the question correctly, and if I'm not answering it, please let me know. I think I'm a big fan of the design argument in the biological arena, and I'm a devotee of William Paley. I've been reading and thinking about Paley's ideas in his watchmaker argument for probably well over 25 years or more. And the more that I really think about what Paley was arguing, the more impressed I am with his argument. And that argument tends to be highly maligned. It's dismissed by, and there's two main criticisms. One follows after Hume and one follows after Darwin, where Hume claims that the logic that undergirds the argument is flawed, whereas Darwin claims that natural selection is the blind watchmaker. But actually, there are things that have happened in the last few decades in our understanding of biochemical systems that, to me, revitalize the watchmaker argument, because we've discovered things like molecular scale machines, massive protein complexes that literally are machines in every sense of the word, that I think fully address any kind of Humean type of critique of the watchmaker argument. And when you're talking about biochemistry, the blind watchmaker in that context is going to be essentially chemical evolution. And this is a place where we can show very clearly that at this point in time, nobody knows how chemical evolution could generate the very first life forms. In fact, I would argue that work in chemical evolution is ironically revealing the necessary role an intelligent agent must play in turning chemicals into cells. And so to me, those two major critiques don't stand, given what we've learned about biochemistry. And so I think kind of recapitulating the watchmaker argument is a really good strategy for us to use. And what Paley's whole point, and many people, I've just been recently engaging some skeptics online about the watchmaker argument. And many people actually don't understand that the argument. Paley basically framed the argument this way: that he was talking about taking a stroll and you find a rock on the ground, and he said, well, how would you explain where the rock comes from? Well, you can explain it through natural process mechanisms. But if you discover a watch, you would conclude that that explanation doesn't apply to the watch. And Paley was arguing that it's because the watch has certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. And so we know that a watch requires a watchmaker. And so therefore, the watch becomes this excellent case study for what is it about that design or that system that indicates the work of a mind. And so Paley coined a term that or not a coin, but he used a term called contrivance, that it's a contrivance. There's an artificiality to it. It's composed of parts that seem to interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. There's an ingenuity, there's a foresight, if you will, in that design. And so you have people today in the modern day intelligent design movement, like Michael Behe, who use the term irreducible complexity. Well, he's really saying the same thing that Paley is, where Paley's talking about a contrivance, or Bill Dembski's specified complexity. That's, again, a contrivance. Or Doug Axe talks about functional coherence. That Paley said. In my book, The Cells Design, I talk about an intelligent design pattern. That is, that when we look at things that human beings do, there's certain features that are characteristic. And this is what Paley was driving at. So Paley wasn't arguing that biological systems are too complex for evolution to explain or anything like that, which is oftentimes how people kind of think about the watchmaker argument. He wasn't talking about how that biology is complicated or complex. He was talking that it has a certain set of features that reflect the work of a mind. And so when you look at things like molecular motors in the cell, these look identical to that which we would make as human designers. In fact, these machines are far more sophisticated and elegant than anything that we could ever hope to produce. And so, they have those same telltale properties. And so applying the watchmaker argument, you could actually, I believe, revitalize that argument. And there's some interesting twists to the watchmaker argument. Like in the Cells Design, I introduced something that I called the watchmaker prediction, where I argue that our case for design is very powerful right now because so many different biochemical systems bear the hallmark characteristics of designs. But that I actually argue that as we invent new technologies as human designers, we're going to discover that those technologies already exist in the cell. And since I published the Cells Design, there's many examples where that watchmaker prediction are actually satisfied. And then there's what I would call the converse watchmaker argument, where the argument would go something like this, that basically, if the designs in biology are actually the work of a mind, they should be so elegantly designed that they can inspire us to develop designs by copying them or gaining insight from them. And now we see one of the hottest areas in engineering being biomimetics, where people are copying designs in biology. And so the point being is that I think the watchmaker argument is actually an incredibly fertile place to go to construct modern day design arguments. Where again, we see what I would call the revitalized watchmaker argument. There's the watchmaker prediction, and then the converse watchmaker argument, that all kind of work in conjunction, yes, I think, to make it reasonable for someone to look at biochemistry and to say, this really does look like it's the handiwork, of a mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Josh, I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yes. I think you did a great answer. Can you hear Josh now?
Can you hear me
now? No,
I
can't.
Oh, I wonder.
Sorry. I hear you perfectly fine, but.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know why.
All right. If you could repeat this, I think David Hume and a lot of the other skeptics like Charles Darwin, David Hume, and so forth, I think they would probably be convinced of the existence of God.
Yeah, so you'd say if they heard that argument?
Yes.
So he thinks he thinks you're making a pretty convincing argument that if some of these older philosophers like David Hume or the older scientists like Charles Darwin had heard, maybe they would be. And I think Charles Darwin did believe in God, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Darwin is an interesting character because he actually trained to be a clergyman and was very impressed with William Paley, and eventually I think became, at minimum, an agnostic. I would say perhaps even an atheist. And you don't necessarily get that when you read, Origin of Species or The Descent of Man, but it becomes evident when you begin to read the letters that he wrote. There's Darwin. We have record of 15,000 correspondences that Darwin wrote in his day. And there's something called the Darwin Correspondence Project that has cataloged all of those. But also he has an autobiography that he wrote where he clearly expresses what I think to be pretty much atheism, and it's ultimately the problem of evil that really troubled Darwin. And it was the problem primarily of natural evil, or animal pain and suffering, believe it or not. That was probably Darwin's chief complaint against the idea of God's existence. So Darwin is very coy in his scientific writings as to what his views are, but in these private correspondences and in his autobiography, which he wrote with the purpose of only just telling his story for his family, it was after his death that his autobiography was published. It wasn't something that he actually intended to publish, interestingly enough. But the Humean criticism shows up quite a bit today, because Hume basically argued that, look, the problem with the watchmaker argument is that it's analogical reasoning. And when you're reasoning using analogies, the more similar the things you're comparing, the more certain the conclusion. The less similar, the less certain the conclusion. And so Hume argued that, look, a watch and a living organism are so different from each other, you can't really conclude that just because a watch requires a watchmaker, the same would apply to an organism or to a biological system. And this is where the molecular motors come into play and other features of the cell, because we're not looking at just an isolated system, but we're looking at virtually every system in the cell that bears, again, the hallmarks of design, and that there's all kinds of different systems in the cell that are eerie in terms of their similarity to human designs. But you have, and so that I think addresses really the Humean criticism. But it's interesting because you have philosophers like Massimo Pigliucci, as an example, who said, well, when ID people are talking about information or machines in the cell, they're overlooking the fact that this is really the use of metaphorical language, that this isn't really information, or these really aren't machines, that this is just metaphorical language, illustrative analogies that people are using in science to give them some kind of handle on what they are looking at as biochemists when they study these systems. But you have work that's been done in nanotechnology that completely obliterates that criticism. So, for example, one of my favorite molecular motors is something called ATP synthase, and it's literally an electrically powered rotary motor that is ubiquitous in biology. Every organism has this machine. It probably existed in the very first cells, maybe even in an evolutionary framework, even before the last universal common ancestor. It's the energy transduction machine that allows the cell to harvest energy for its use, and it's found, again, in every domain of life. And so this is a very early appearing molecular motor. And so there's really not time for this thing to evolve, and it's an incredibly complex system. But it's, again, electrically powered rotary motor, and there have been scientists who are trying to build these nano machines that literally have isolated that protein complex from cells and have interfaced it to nano machines so that it would function as a rotary motor inside these nano machines. So these nano scientists are looking at this as if it was a machine. They're deploying it as a machine. Or, you hear people claim, well, information in the cell isn't really information. Well, I just wrote a blog article that'll be published in a few weeks where people have actually shown that the mathematical structure of information in biochemical systems is identical to the mathematical structure of languages. And so there's a deep, that information is structured in the way we would structure information, and it's not immediately evident about in terms of the similarity between human languages and biochemical information until you begin to apply these mathematical tools where you begin to see this deep-seated mathematical structure that's identical in language and in biochemical systems. Or the fact that people are treating DNA as digital information and then using that digital treatment of that DNA in the machines that manipulate DNA, they're treating this as essentially a computer system. And what's going on here is that the machines that manipulate DNA in the cell are literally functioning at their basic essence as computer systems are. Excuse me.
That's incredible. That's fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, and so when DNA is metabolized in the cell, excuse me, during DNA replication or transcription or DNA repair, it literally is a very sophisticated computer operation. So much so that there's a whole area of nanotechnology called DNA computing, where people are literally building computers out of DNA and the enzymes that manipulate them. And these computers are housed in little tiny Eppendorf test tubes. They're wet computers, meaning that they're molecules in solution, but yet they're more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based computer system. In fact, people are actually solving problems with these DNA computers that supercomputer systems can't solve because of the advantages that you get with DNA computing. So the point is that this Humean critique just gets completely obliterated when nanotechnologists are actually treating the machines in the cell like machines. They're treating the information in DNA like information, like we would treat it. And so, the Humean criticism doesn't hold. And then the Darwinian criticism that evolution is the blind watchmaker doesn't hold either, because let's look at, the ATP synthase. I mean, this is one of the very first, this is a massive protein complex that has to be coupled to a very sophisticated process called electron transport chain. That this has to have emerged practically at the time that life emerges on Earth. So there's not time for evolution to concoct this kind of elegant system that again is indispensable for life, but bears so much of the hallmarks of a design system.
That's fascinating.
Yes.
What's your theory on and I'm getting a lot of questions in the audience. I'm going to try to get to everybody's, and one of the questions I'll get to you, Dan. Just hold on. But I wanted to see it, kind of building off that a little bit. What's your theory in because I've read Hugh Ross's books on his theories of how Genesis comes together with science, but how Adam and Eve, what is your theory on the first people? Or were there first people? A lot of people who argue for evolution say, well, no, sort of a bottleneck occurred and a bunch of people popped into existence around the same time. So.
Yeah. Well, I take the view that when I read scripture that I don't know how you sidestep a historical Adam and Eve as the first human beings. And, when it comes to the human genetics and population genetics applied to human beings, it's increasingly becoming, I think, extremely opaque to try to understand what's going on. The work is so model dependent right now. But there is this very provocative concept called mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, where it does look like, with respect to these two genetic markers, that humanity traces an origin back to single ancestral sequences that are dubbed mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, respectively. And there are some people who argue that these were actually literal individuals. And so, they're very, at least with certain genetic markers, there looks like there were, a primordial pair. And it turns out that the data now seems to indicate that they would have likely have existed at about the same time and in the same location. Now, people are arguing right now that there's too much genetic diversity in the human gene pool today to come from two individuals. And the reason they say that is because there are mathematical models that take genetic diversity and relate it to the original population size. And we've written a number of articles and based on work done in conservation biology that actually show that those models don't really work very well. And so the conclusion that there wasn't a pair but a population is really based on some very complex modeling that I'm not convinced at this point is actually giving us reliable data or reliable insights. And in fact, other people have demonstrated that there's no data from science today that indicates that humanity couldn't have come from two individuals, that in fact, the genetic diversity that we're looking at today very well could be accounted for if humanity did indeed come from two individuals. So it's still an open question, but I think the point I would make is that this idea that a historical Adam and Eve aren't credible isn't something that you would arrive at necessarily because the scientific evidence compels you. To me, I think the scientific evidence is largely ambivalent. But if I had to argue today for the credibility of the biblical account of human origins, where I would go would be actually to focus on a scientific case for the image of God. Because in the last few years, there's some remarkable concessions that are being made by evolutionary biologists working in anthropology and primatology, where there's a growing consensus that human beings seem to be exceptional. This is called human exceptionalism, and believe you me, people in a lot of areas of academia find that idea, completely distasteful. That human beings would somehow be different than any other creature, that we would be different in kind from other creatures, not different in degree. But this is actually an idea that is gaining popularity, at least with a growing minority of anthropologists who really are arguing we seem to be exceptional. And the qualities that make us exceptional are scientific descriptors that we would understand as Christians as reflecting the image of God. And so we can show that at least that the idea that we, again, uniquely bear God's image is a concept that has scientific support. But what's wild is that what seems to make us unique is unique to human beings. It shows up suddenly when human beings appear in the archaeological record. And the work, for example, in the origin of language exemplifies human exceptionalism. And because many people think that what makes us exceptional is in large measure our capacity for symbolism, and language is a manifestation of that. Well, there's no evolutionary model that can explain the origin of language. Language seems to be instantiated all at once in human beings. And when it is that the language that we communicate with at the very onset of our capability of possessing language seems to be as complex as modern day language is. So there's no evolution of language. It just shows up suddenly, fully installed in human beings. And our brain structure is such that it's highly unlikely that any other creature, including creatures like Neanderthals, would have had language capacity. Our brain structure uniquely seems to support our language capacity, even compared to creatures like Neanderthals. So to me, I think there's a really strong case that we could make that human beings do bear God's image, that that we are exceptional, that there's seems to be something to that the biblical creation account in that sense. And again, I still think that the idea of a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosomal Adam are provocative, though I don't think you can have the same level of confidence in the biblical account of human origins when it comes to the origin of humanity as you could, let's say, with regard to the beginning of the universe and what we see coming from cosmology. So the confidence level isn't there, but to me, the good news is that you could actually accommodate the data that's coming from anthropology in an old Earth, creationist model, and retain a historicity of Adam and Eve with, I think, a large measure of integrity.
Well, that's fascinating. I appreciate that, because
Yes.
it gave us a lot of information. And is there anything else besides language and symbols? Because I've heard also we have this apprehension for beauty that distinguishes us from other life forms.
Yes. Yeah. And this is something that I'm beginning to get interested in, is this idea of an argument from beauty. And what can are there ways that science can kind of inform that very powerful argument? And, and to me, I think one of the things that is, remarkable about science is that it actually does uncover levels or a depth of the beauty of nature that isn't necessarily evident when we just look at nature and appreciate, the beauty of a sunset or the beauty of a flower. Those are very real, very real responses to nature. But when I wrote an article about a year or two ago now, about there being an underlying mathematical structure to the distribution of fatty acids that we see in biological systems, and it's essentially, oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank now. The golden ratio, but essentially the mathematical model that it accounts for the distribution of fatty acid species in nature conforms to this to the goal. And so there's this underlying mathematical structure that we discovered that explains something that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily think would have any kind of undergirding of that sort. And so science is uncovering levels of beauty in areas that we wouldn't necessarily think beauty exists. So I think there's a very powerful argument there. But one of the big questions in evolutionary biology is, how do we explain the origin of our aesthetic sense? I floated out some ideas about the argument of beauty online, and had a couple of skeptics come back and challenge me on that, saying, well, there are evolutionary models that explain the evolution of our aesthetic sense. But when I looked at those models, I didn't find those models to be very impressive, frankly. They seemed like quite a bit of hand waving and these evolutionary just so stories. And when you read those those articles, those scientific articles, trying to understand the evolutionary origin of our aesthetic sense, it becomes clear that there's just not an explanation to account for our sense of beauty. So I think this is a really powerful argument that complements the idea of human exceptionalism, and is a fertile area for people that are interested in apologetics. I don't think enough work has been done, honestly, when it comes to the argument from beauty. I think there's a great contribution that people that are looking at this philosophically and scientifically could make.
I agree with you, and actually, I found a dissertation on that exact argument, and I've thought it fascinating. But it's not probably something that a lot of people have seen or read. I haven't found that much on that on beauty, and so let me ask you this, and this is kind of a little bit related, but going back to the idea of evolution, a lot of times when we argue for things, people will say, well, we have empathy, so we must have evolved this way. It must have benefited us to be empathetic, and therefore that's why we have empathy. And I say, well, why do we have selfishness then? And why does everybody know we all have this moral intuition to be benevolent? Actually, I've seen studies that have shown that we do have universal morals and universal moral duties to be benevolent. There's a study by Schwartz in 2012 that speaks to that. In every single country, people knew they ought to be benevolent, even if the practices weren't matching up with that. But I wanted to ask you, where do you think the idea of what do you think of the argument that we often hear from skeptics on what explains our empathy?
Yeah, I have not done a ton of work in that area, and what I'll do is I'll maybe, I wouldn't say I'll punt, but I'll rely on the work of a evolutionary psychologist by the name of Thomas Suddendorf, and he's written a really great book called The Gap that I would highly commend to anybody. He's writing, again, not from a Christian worldview perspective, but from the perspective of an evolutionary framework. And Suddendorf is one of these people that argues for human exceptionalism. And the point that he makes is that so often people will interpret the results of animal studies where they'll say, well, animals seem to display some sense of empathy, and his argument is, well, they're displaying empathy, but human beings are displaying morality, and that you can't evolve from the pathway. There's not a pathway from empathy to morality, that it's a chasm, right? And that animals show some problem solving capability, but they don't show abstract reasoning, an open-ended ability to solve problems. And so he points to all these features that people have traditionally viewed animals possessing as antecedents to the behaviors we show as humans, and argues that none of those behaviors are really the stepping stones to what human beings display. Animals communicate, but we have, again, open-ended capacity for language, right? Animals solve problems. We have abstract reasonings. Animals show empathy, but humans show morality. And, the former is not a stepping stone to the latter, but these really are qualitatively different qualities. So, for people like Suddendorf, they don't see that evolutionary account as bearing, much credence.
Oh, that's bad. Did you want to, Josh? You want to ask? Well, I'll repeat it.
Can you hear me right now, Dr. Rana?
I can hear Josh.
Okay. I wanted to ask Dr. Rana what he would say about the often skeptical rejoinder that Christians and other people of religion, other people of faith, use a God of the gaps type argument. Could you ask Dr. Rana that, please?
Okay, so Josh wants to know about the God of the gaps argument, because a lot of times people will say, well, you're just filling in the information with God, and that's not a reasonable thing. And instead, they would rather probably say, I don't know. So
yeah,
I don't know how our origin started, or I don't know how the universe began, or I don't know what was before the Big Bang, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and to me, I think I've heard some philosophers make the argument that God of the gap reasoning is actually a legitimate way to reason to a conclusion. I don't completely understand the argument that's being made by philosophers, so I'm not going to go down that path, other than just to make people aware that I have seen philosophers argue that God of the gap reasoning is actually a legitimate way to reason. It's not a fallacy or not fallacious reasoning. Excuse me, sorry. But if that becomes an issue that is keeping somebody from really entertaining the evidence for the scientific evidence for a creator or for the Christian faith, then what I want to do is as an apologist, try to meet them where they're at and say, okay, if you're concerned about reaching a God of the gaps conclusion and you prefer not, that's not going to convince you, well, then what can we do to address that? And to me, I think most of the arguments that people are making as apologists are not technically God of the gaps arguments. So, for example, the approach that I use to argue, to make a comprehensive argument for design, is actually modeled after what archaeologists do when they detect the work of intelligent agencies. And what I'm thinking here are archaeologists that are working with the hominin archaeological record, not working with an archaeological record that's clearly made by modern humans. So these archaeologists are very good at picking up a rock and saying, okay, a hominin of some sort shaped this, as opposed to this was shaped by natural processes. And they do that because, first of all, it shows some kind of artificiality to it. There's some kind of telltale signature that this was manipulated by an intelligent agent. And this goes back to the watchmaker argument of Paley. And then what they try to do also is rule out any kind of other natural process explanation. And then typically they'll go in a lab and they'll try to replicate the production of that particular artifact just to see what does it take to produce an artifact like that. And so what they've done is they've seen indications of design, they've ruled out natural process explanations, and then they've tried to see what does it take to make it in a laboratory. Well, to me, that becomes a really powerful set of reasoning or set of tools that we can use to make a case for design, where we could use the watchmaker argument to say, look, biochemical systems look like they're designed. We can go to original life research and say, any explanation to try to account for that design seems to come up short when it comes to the origin of life. And then we now are at a point where people are trying to create cells in a laboratory. And when you look at what's required, it requires an enormous amount of ingenuity and intelligent, an effort. It requires intelligent agency to pull it off. So what we have here are three conclusions that reinforce each other. There's the appearance of design. That design can't be explained through mechanism, and that we know that intelligent agency is required. So it's like a three-pronged argument for design. So it's not a God of the gaps argument. We're not saying, well, evolution can't explain the origin of life, therefore God did it. It's a much more sophisticated argument. Or, let's say if we go to the beginning of the universe. Well, I mean, there's evidence that the universe had a beginning. That's not God of the gaps reasoning. There looks like there's evidence that the universe has a beginning. And so the question then becomes, well, how do we account for that beginning? And so that's not God of the gaps reasoning. Or you can't, to me, to say, okay, we don't know how the universe began, you can't really sidestep, I think, the implications that the universe has a beginning, because either there's some kind of mechanism that causes a universe to come into existence, or there's a mind, a creator that's responsible. I mean, those are the two options that you have. And technically, they both are equivalent explanations. They are philosophically equivalent explanations. And so I don't see that as a God of the gaps reasoning whatsoever, but you're reasoning based on, I think, the evidence that we have in front of us today. And then couple that with the fact that the universe appears to be designed. This is the anthropic principle. That's another piece of evidence that seems to favor, again, there's a mind behind the universe.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, I think the obvious thing is looking at the beginning of time, space, and matter. What preceded that had to be timeless, immaterial, and powerful, and also intentional. And so I think that points to God. And I think that's why a lot of those people before the Big Bang was sort of discovered or theorized, a lot of those people, a lot of atheists and skeptics preferred the idea that there not be a beginning.
Right.
Because they realized it had logical implications.
Yep.
And
that's exactly right.
I had a remark. I wanted Dr. Rana to comment on it.
So Josh is saying something. I'm going to listen to his question and I'll repeat it.
Do you think Could he explain or delineate how Christian theism has a better explanation, a better explanatory answer than atheism, because atheism can only give a naturalistic explanation and must avoid design at all costs? Could you ask him about
Yeah.
that?
So he wants to know how Christianity itself is the best explanation for some of the things that we see around with biology, as opposed to atheism with the naturalist sort of explanation.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, I think in large measure what we see in biology, clearly indicates that there, in my view at least, that there's a mind behind life itself. And I would even say that it seems to be a mind that's behind the history of life as well. And to me, it's to go from there to the God of the Bible is probably an unwarranted leap. But it is provocative to me that so many of the designs that we've been talking about in biochemical systems actually bear a similarity to human designs, which to me suggests that there's some kind of resonance between the human mind and that divine mind. And that could be explained with the image of God concept. So that begins to move you from design and biology to at least a Judeo-Christian understanding of humanity. That at least the image of God concept explains those similarities in designs. But to me, I think there's other areas of science that really help us, I think, distinguish who that creator or that mind is. I mean, we talked about the fact that the universe has a beginning. Well, that means that there's a transcendent cause to the universe. And we see design, not only in biology, but in the universe itself, that design suggests a personality. So at least it's a personal, transcendent creator that we can conclude, which now leaves you with, either, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam as your options. And, I think the fact that we see a universe that conforms to laws, that there's an orderliness to the universe, a predictability, suggests that this creator is a God of order, of constancy. So I don't see a capricious God like the God of Islam as essentially accounting for a universe with this kind of regularity. And I think you could, this is one of Hume's criticisms. Well, how do you know it's a single designer, not multiple designers? Well, when you look at the universal nature of biochemistry as an example, where all life on Earth that bears this evidence for design has a core set of chemical systems, that suggests there's a single mind behind it. So I think just, doing a little bit of natural theology, and this is kind of armchair natural theology to be clear, I think you begin to see evidence from science in totality that suggests it really does look like it's the God of the Bible that's responsible when we look at, again, nature itself. And of course that is beautifully complemented with this very powerful case that we can make historically for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So I think when you put it all together, the Christian view seems to me to be the best. And and it's also interesting as well that in many respects, the tool that we're using to discern evidence for a creator from science is a tool that is really only possible in a Christian worldview context. So to me, I think if you don't have a worldview like Christianity or something that is a very close facsimile to it, it's very difficult to justify the scientific enterprise. I mean, the fact that we believe that the universe is orderly, that the laws of nature are going to be the same tomorrow as they are today, and that the laws of nature are going to be the same throughout the universe is a reflection of what we see in Scripture regarding the nature of God, and even things that are stated in Scripture about God being responsible providentially for the processes that take place in nature that are critical to sustain nature, or the fact that the universe is intelligible, flows out of the idea that God has revealed himself to us through the universe itself. And the fact that we're made in God's image means that we are constructed as human beings in a way to discern the universe around us and to make sense of the universe. So these are ideas that naturally flow out of a Christian worldview. But if you adopt an atheistic worldview, I'm not saying that you can't do science and do it well, but you don't really have any kind of philosophical framework, I think, to ground the scientific enterprise. There's nothing in a materialistic framework that would lead you to think that there should be constancies to the laws of nature, an orderliness to the universe, or that the universe should be inherently intelligible, or that our senses are reliable as human beings in such a way that we could trust what we learn about the universe as human beings, if we're the product of an evolutionary history.
Yeah, and let me go back to what you said. You just mentioned the Muslim God in passing, and so it's my understanding, and I wanted to see if you can let me know if this is a good understanding. It's my understanding that the Muslim faith and Muslims believe that Allah is sort of transcended but not immanent, and in Christian faith we believe that God is both immanent and transcendent, meaning He's in our universe and He's also beyond our universe, essentially.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And this idea that the God of Islam and the God of Christianity are the same God is not really true. Because as you're pointing out, we both would agree that God is wholly transcendent. We I think would believe that God is sovereign, that God is a creator. But for a Muslim, God is essentially unknowable. And in a sense, what flows out of this is an incredibly high respect for God. And that is, if God is this transcendent creator that's holy, that is sovereign, it almost seems insulting to God to say that as a human being we somehow can know God or know anything about God. And so all we can know, according to a Muslim, about Allah is what Allah wills. We can't know Allah, but we can know what Allah wills. But even then, the will of Allah, which is represented in the Quran, was communicated indirectly through the archangel Gabriel, right? And so the idea that God would be immanent in His creation is viewed as being blasphemous, because you're causing God to condescend. That God is too great to be present in His creation. So there's a very high view of God and His holiness and His sovereignty and His nature that flows out of that perspective. But this, to me, is what makes Christianity so incredibly remarkable, is that we see that God wants us to know Him. And it's true that God would fundamentally be hidden from us as finite creatures, unless God chooses to make Himself known to us. And so God has revealed Himself to us through the record of nature. This is mind-blowing that He's revealing Himself in that way. But then, even then, when He comes to the person of Christ, we see the full revelation of God, at least in terms of what is our ultimate capacity to understand God in any way. Person of Christ, where God is, in the person of Christ, is fully God and fully human. God is ultimately revealed to us through Christ Himself. And again, for a Muslim, that is a horrific statement, right? Because God is condescending Himself to take on the form of a human being, and God would condescend Himself to the point where He would allow Himself to be brutalized on the cross. But to me, this highlights, I think, the love that God has for us, that God wants us to know Him. That if you think about it, and I'll tell you a story about my father, who was this domineering Indian father who was absolutely no nonsense, and a very, very proud man, and rightfully so. He was a very brilliant, highly accomplished man. And I can remember I got in trouble. I was a troublemaker in high school, and I got in trouble, and my high school senior English teacher threatened to fail me in English class, which means I wouldn't have graduated. So I would have gone from being valedictorian to basically not graduating because of, a pretty serious indiscretion on my part.
Wow. Yeah.
In my senior year. But again, I was a troublemaker. And I literally saw my father begging this woman not to do that. And I was really, I've never seen my father adopt that posture. And it's like my father, I've never seen him condescend himself, to use that language, in that way to another human being ever. And it's like, how, and I felt horrible at that point that what I had done caused my father to have to go through that. But it also communicated to me how much my father actually really loved me, that he was willing to condescend himself for my sake. I mean, it's one thing to die for another human being, because in that death, there's an element of nobility that you sacrificed yourself for another human being. But to actually humble yourself, to condescend yourself for the sake of another human being, that to me is a deeper expression of love. And so with Christ, with the idea that God would condescend to take on the form of a human being, is the ultimate expression of love. Only love would cause a transcendent creator of the universe to do something like that. And so what so many Muslims find to be deeply offensive is actually something that highlights the greatness of God beyond anything we could ever imagine, the fact that he actually would condescend himself. So there's a real logic, I think, to what we see in the person of Christ and in the crucifixion of Christ for our sake.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I think that's a nice way to look at it. And it's an interesting experience you had with your dad, because obviously that kind of gave you a glimpse of what our father's love is like. So I think that's wonderful. Now, I keep getting a question in the audience from a particular person called Deconverted Man. His name is Dan, and he wants to know how active you are in publishing. Like, I don't know if where you are at Reasons to Believe, if you actually do academic publications still, and if you have peer-reviewed journal articles out there in biochemistry. I don't know if you have that kind of stuff, if you have the motivation to put that out right now. So I wanted to see if you could answer that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now at Reasons to Believe, I don't have a chemistry lab. So I'm not actively doing research towards that end. I did have a lab when I was working at the Procter and Gamble company, and did publish some things prior to joining Reasons to Believe. But a few years ago, I actually wrote, in collaboration with another chemist, a critical review of the different models for membrane origins that was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres. I think the publication date for that was maybe 2009. But I actually took a chapter that is represented in both the Origins of Life and as well as my book, The Cell's Design, and converted it into a journal article that was published. So I just don't have the time or the wherewithal to publish right now. I've got an idea for a couple of other journal articles dealing with the origin of life that, if I ever get time, I'd like to explore. And I'm actually about to embark on a book project exploring the question, is there a biochemical anthropic principle? And my thinking at this point is to actually write that book not as an apologetics book, but rather as a scientific exploration. So it would be something that would be published in a book form, not in a peer-reviewed journal context, but I would solicit peer reviewers. In fact, at Reasons to Believe, all of the books that we publish, we actually send out the manuscripts for peer review. So I have a book coming out in July on transhumanism. And part of the book, we talk about the science behind that is motivating the transhumanism movement. And that was sent out to 2 people in the sciences that reviewed the scientific content. And we also sent it to a theologian to review the philosophical and theological content. So it's part of our practice to solicit peer review before we publish things. So anyway, that's hopefully gives Dan some perspective.
I had one more question.
Okay, Josh has another question. I'll repeat it back.
Is atheism, or can he describe how atheism is built on a useful fiction? and merely not something concretely, objectively true, but a useful fiction.
Okay, he wants to know if you can speak to the idea that atheism is built upon a useful fiction rather than something that's objectively true.
Well,
we have atheists in the audience, of course, might not. they're I'm sure listening.
well, I mean that's an interesting question, and you know, if I think about my experience when I was in college, where again I don't think I would ever have embraced atheism. I settled into a position of agnosticism, leaning probably towards the idea that there was a creator. But you know, when you learn, at least you know, from my experience, when I was learning about the idea that evolutionary processes could explain the origin and the history of life and even the design of life, if you adopt that position, or if you think that the science is compelling you towards that conclusion, I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to say, well, if that's true, then why do I need a creator? I don't have use for that hypothesis. And so I think, you know, when you embrace an evolutionary framework, I think it's not unreasonable, metaphysically speaking, to go from there to then just conclude that God doesn't exist, or to embrace some kind of atheistic framework. And so you have people like Dawkins who said, you know, Darwin makes it possible for someone to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Well, here you have somebody who is an atheist who then, you know, then is using evolution as a way to justify their atheism. But I see a lot of people in the sciences who are, I would call, default atheists, who just think, you know, hey, look, science seems to be able to explain so much that we see around us. Why do we need a creator? And so I guess I'm just settling into a position of atheism as a default. Or you see people like Darwin who sees, you know, natural disasters, natural evil, who sees, you know, pain and suffering in the animal realm. And from that concludes, well, you know, you have to, at that point, develop a theodicy. And so for many people, atheism becomes a theodicy, you know, where it's just a pitiless, indifferent universe that we live in, and that they see features in the universe that seem to support that notion, and so they settle into a position of atheism, I think for very, very good reasons. So I don't know that I would say that everybody that's an atheist is necessarily, you know, arriving that at that position as a useful fiction, but rather I would say that it, you know, there are some people that are atheists and then will use science and appropriate science to support their atheism. But I see a lot of people where it's the other way around. And to me, I think this is where apologetics becomes very important in the scientific arena, is to help people work through things like the problem of pain and suffering that we see in animals, or how can we make sense of natural disasters. And I think both philosophy and science working in conjunction can I think many times adequately answer those questions. Or, you know, is it really true that evolution can explain everything? Because if it can't, that then opens up the possibility that there's a mind somehow, you know, or yeah. So I think for some people atheism is probably a useful fiction, but for other people I think they honestly have arrived at a position of atheism for, in their minds, what they would think are very good objective reasons.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I wanted to ask a couple other questions from the audience. I know we're getting towards the end of our chat, but I have Susan in the audience. She goes by Slammed, if you see her in the thing there. She wanted to know if you're familiar with Dr. Colin Patterson, and also if you've read David Galinter's Giving Up Darwin. And I'm not with either, so I'm just wondering if you are.
Well, I'm familiar with Colin Patterson. He was an evolutionary biologist. I think he must have died by now. I was familiar with him, you know, probably over 30 years ago, and he was a very, I think he was a fairly outspoken paleontologist who questioned the idea that there were the types of transitional forms that you would expect to see in the fossil record if indeed Darwin's conception of evolution was valid. So he had some remarkable quotes that many people that were ID people and creationists would have latched onto and would have communicated. But the other gentleman I'm not familiar with.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm trying to look through I'm looking through the audience questions because I know there were a couple I missed here, so I'm trying to quickly get these out in front of me. I wanted to thank everybody in the audience who's been listening in, and people who come on here later. It's wonderful that you came around. And I'm trying to find any other questions. I seem to have not found the questions. I think we've asked a lot of them, but I'm not sure.
I have one more question.
If anyone has one, go ahead and post it. Okay, Josh, you have another question?
Yeah. In Dr. Rana's experience of presenting a cumulative case, the Christian evidences and the teleological and other arguments for the existence of God, how has the scientific community looked at that and answered that case for Christian theism?
So when you present a case for Christian theology and the idea of looking at teleological arguments and cosmological arguments, how has the scientific community
Yes,
been able
the scientific community.
I missed the last part of that question. How's the scientific community?
How does the scientific community address these arguments? Like for example, if we look at Hugh Ross has this idea that there are 10 habitable zones on Earth, and that there's no other planet quite like us that has these, that we've identified, of the 3,000 other planets that are somewhat similar to us that have all 10 habitable zones. And so how do the scientists, when we say that probably it shows that there must be a designer or an intelligence, what do they say? Just, we don't know? Or
Yeah, well, this is where I think having an understanding of the philosophical framework that undergirds science becomes really helpful, because science operates according to a framework known as methodological naturalism. And this framework constrains scientific investigation so that scientists are looking only for mechanistic, process-driven explanations for the universe and phenomena in the universe. And so in that framework, design or teleology is just simply a priori not allowed into the conversation. And so this explains in part why, for example, you'll see people saying, well, we don't know how life originates. We readily admit we have no idea how life originates. They'll even acknowledge all of the very real and seemingly intractable problems with the origin of life. And these are people that are working in this discipline as part of their profession. And yet they, at the same time, express this confidence that evolutionary mechanisms must have generated life. And so what's happening is that they've adopted a philosophical framework to guide the methodology of science, and that methodology now becomes a metaphysical commitment to the idea that it's materialism and materialism alone. And so almost always you'll see people just rejecting the design argument outright, or rejecting any kind of criticism of the origin of life outright in terms of attaching any theological significance to it. But yet nobody that works in biochemistry would deny the appearance of design in biochemical systems. They're very quick to acknowledge that design, and they marvel at it just in the same way that we would marvel at it. It's just that we attach a theological conclusion to it, and these scientists refuse to go down that path.
Yeah, well, I know another biochemist called Cy Gart, and he's a Christian too. So he was atheist for a long time, and he became a Christian. So I think that maybe the science sometimes leads people towards Christianity when you look at that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was definitely the case, for me, is that really looked to me like there was a mind behind everything. But that is just simply not considered to be a viable hypothesis that you could explore scientifically. The scientific community just simply won't allow it, and it's because of the constraints of methodological naturalism that then people oftentimes again carry over to philosophical commitments that aren't necessarily warranted.
I have one.
I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at scientific apologetics, it's basically philosophy that's masquerading as science. I mean, everything that we've talked about ultimately are philosophical arguments where it's being informed by science. And I think when people realize that, it becomes very helpful to know how to use science as a tool in apologetics, and also how to respond to objections that people raise, because many times those objections really have a philosophical commitment that is associated with them.
I have one more thing.
Oh, Josh has another question. Before that, Josh, let me just ask this before it goes off my screen. Susan wants to know, isn't it time for evolutionary biologists to admit that Darwin's mechanisms just don't work? How long will it take? And Utopia Buster is saying biological fine-tuning. So I don't think that's really a question from Utopia Buster, but it might be an explanation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, most people that are evolutionary biologists today would probably not embrace Darwin's theory of evolution. In fact, we were chatting off the air about the Royal Society meeting and something called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And there's a growing number of evolutionary biologists who think that evolutionary theory as currently conceived is inadequate to explain really not the biological innovation, the generation of novelty, the generation of body plans. The feeling is that Darwin's mechanisms are really good at accounting for, microevolution and speciation, maybe changes that we're seeing at a microbial level, but there seems to be something fundamentally missing that is needed to explain, things like the Cambrian explosion or the origin of eukaryotic cells. So there's a lot of people that are, again, I wouldn't say abandoning Darwin, but looking to expand Darwin. And to me, this is really good news, because this is an indication that there is some basis, legitimate scientific basis, to be skeptical of the grand claims of evolution, that it can account for everything in its totality in biology. And so even if, even if one isn't able to level a detailed critique against aspects of the evolutionary framework, I am, but a lot of people are not. You can at least point to the fact that there are people that are beginning to question the full compatibility or the full explanatory power of the evolutionary paradigm. And that, to me, again, there is an admission, in other words, on the part of biologists. It's just that they many times will freely admit this in a professional context, buried in journal articles or behind closed doors at scientific meetings. They're reticent to communicate this broadly to the public because of concerns about how ID people and creationists would exploit those admissions.
Yeah, I'd admit that I probably would want to exploit that. But let me ask you this, Josh. You have another question. Did you want to say it, and I'll repeat it?
Yes. This is my last question. I wanted to ask Dr. Rana, considering the philosophical commitments of atheism towards methodological naturalism, do you think the theist can turn the tables and say that's atheism of the gaps?
Oh, so Josh is looking at the idea of naturalism with atheism, and so can we turn the
naturalism?
Methodological naturalism. So can we turn the tables and say that's atheism of the gaps?
Yeah. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, so often, let's take the origin of life as an example. The fact that people are absolutely convinced that there will be an evolutionary mechanism or set of mechanisms discovered that could explain the origin of life one day is a faith commitment to a materialistic explanation, regardless of what the evidence says.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, and I'll be the first to admit, and I do have preconceived notions about certain things and preconceived ideas about the Lord, and so sometimes we do take our ideas or our biases with us as we address this new information that we get through our lives. So
Yeah.
I'd say that's probably fair. Well, are you ready to share with where we can find you? And Josh, if you want to, I'll just mention Josh is here. He hasn't. Dr. Rana cannot hear him, but I was able to hear him, which is why I was repeating it back in case you joined us a little bit later. But maybe we'll start with Josh if you wanted to say, well, how we'll find you, and then we'll go to Dr. Rana because he also maybe could mention some of his book titles that people might find interesting, and also where we'd be able to find the book that you're coming out with this July. So, but I'll first start with Josh.
Well, you can find me on Twitter, Apologist Supreme. I like to participate in debates and like to do interviews with you and Red Pill Religion. At Red Pill Religion, in fact, we defend all religions against atheism, and we try to fight back against the harassment that goes on online. But thank you for this opportunity, and please tell Dr. Rana that.
Thank you. So Josh says, thank you for the opportunity. You can, of course, find him at Red Pill Religion. And so now I want to go to Dr. Rana. If you could also share information about how we can find you and your books and what's coming out in July and where we can get that.
Yeah, sure. Well, if people want to find out about the organization I work for, we can go to reasons.org, which is our website. And I have a blog there called The Cell's Design that I blog about once a week on new discoveries that provide evidence for the Christian faith. I'm also active on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, so people can connect with me there. And then in July, I have a book called Humans 2.0 that I've co-authored with Ken Samples. Essentially, it's a scientific, philosophical, and biblical perspectives on the transhumanism movement. So it's the goal of that book is to try to demonstrate to Christians how we can use the transhumanism movement to engage our culture and ultimately to build a bridge to the gospel.
Oh, that's fantastic. You might have noticed I have a picture of a bridge on my on this video. So I like the idea of trying to build bridges between people. So I think that sounds wonderful. So I want to say thank you very much to everybody for coming in the audience today. Thank you for your questions. If I wasn't able to get to some, I apologize. But I think we had a really very intellectually robust conversation today. And so I'm very excited about that. And I learned a lot. And I might even go and re-listen to this so I can take notes next time, much more detailed notes on some of the things you mentioned, because I want to use those and arm myself with that kind of information when we're talking to skeptics out there, because there are so many.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast, and thank you, Josh, too. Thank you.